Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware, A-W-A-R-E, are the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, June 20th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government as an excuse, not as a reason, for their wars. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. Aware was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001. And before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan on 7th October 2001, which began America's longest war. Barack Obama was the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. The founders of Aware saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but it's in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over economic rivals from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. And international polls show that the U.S. is the most feared country in the world, far more than Russia or China. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to 1. Establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2. End the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3. Cut military spending by at least 50% and close the more than 700 foreign military bases. Russia has no more than 15, China has 1. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4. Stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account in the American media, which is dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike. We'll try to give a better account tonight, beginning, I think, with Stuart Levy. You're going to talk first about the cost of war, so to speak?
I'll say a little bit about that. In terms that, well, let me see. So this last weekend, there was a panel that Aware didn't participate in, but a lot of good people did.
We did actually.
Did? Oh, okay.
We were there.
All right.
Yes.
All right, fine. Anyway,
Yes.
a panel on the hidden cost of war. So omitting all the other reasons we should be objecting to war, as Carl has been talking about, from the immorality, its ineffectiveness, its creation of millions of refugees, the fact that the war is a racket. Omitting all of that, we can talk in terms of the economic cost of war and what we within the U.S. give up by pursuing it. And so, one good resource that we could recommend for looking at an analysis of that is from the War Resisters League. They're warresisters.org, and they've been in this game for a long time, looking among other things closely at the federal budget. Where do our expenditures go? Comparing expenditures for domestic things versus the expenditures that are due to the military. So the familiar picture is pretty small here, but the biggest chunk of the familiar picture, which you would get if you look at the, thank you for zooming in on that. That's great. Has a huge chunk for, if I can get my fingers right, Social Security, Medicare, and so on. That's a huge lump, but a lot of the reason that it looks huge and that this military expenditures segment looks so modest is that it's counting. So Social Security has its own trust fund. It has its own income source. You don't pay for it through your normal April 15th income taxes. It gets paid for by payroll taxes. And so by adding this huge additional term into federal expenses, it makes military and kind of everything else look modest. They say this is the wrong way to do it, and they have instead, let's see if I can, they say, let's look at the expenditures that are related to what you pay on April 15th, what your conventional income taxes go to. By that measure, if you could zoom back just a little bit to, thank you, that's good, I think. Yeah. So there's still a large chunk that goes to human resources of various sorts, Department of Education, Health and Human Services, and things like that. By this measure, fully a quarter of our income tax money, $768 billion last year, goes to current military stuff. And there's a bunch of pieces of that, from military personnel, about a seventh of $1 trillion, research and development, $71 billion. There's a lot of terms. This is current military expenditures. Then there are past military expenditures. So we should count, as the IRS.gov icon doesn't, we should count the expenses of taking care of our veterans. You know, we put them through our military system. We owe it to take care of them, but we should consider that the expense of the whole system of veterans and of the military pensions as part of the cost of running a military the way we run it. It's a burden. It's an economic burden. And so if we can have a smaller military, we'll have fewer people, we'll have fewer veterans, we'll have fewer expenses associated with those veterans. This isn't saying dump the veterans, it's saying just let's have a smaller military. By other measures, the expenditures are for general government stuff, like running the Department of Justice, the legislature, and so on. That's a couple of $100 billion. And sort of a bunch of other things. So Department of Agriculture, the Department of Interior, all we spend on transportation, for better and worse, is another 5%. So just the costs that go to the military are nearly half of the income taxes that almost everybody pays on April 15th. And it doesn't have to be this way. One sort of measure that they have looked at that's not plotted on this plot looks at how the military budget has varied over time since the time of, say, the Vietnam War in constant dollars. So those of us who lived through the time of the Vietnam War might remember it as being, it was a time of, people talked about it as a time of extravagance. We ran up a debt like we'd never run up before. It was tens of billions of dollars, which was an enormous debt. And the military spending actually did fall after the end of that war and rose again in Reagan's time with the big military buildup then. So in constant dollars, we were spending more in Reagan's time in the 1980s. Then that decreased again in the 1990s and then rose again with the so-called War on Terror. And now we have something that's about 30% higher than at the peak of the Vietnam War is our current military spending. We don't have 500, 700,000 troops in the field, for better or worse, but our military spending has continued to grow. And with the new Trump administration proposed budget, it would grow by another $50 billion or something like that on top of all the other things that.
54 billion, I think it is.
Yes. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Stuart. You are watching Aware on the Air. I think if we think about cost accounting in the war, we'll realize fairly quickly that by we I mean the United States of America, should be spending a great deal more than in fact we do spend on war and war-related matters, as Stuart has just been describing. What we should be spending on is reparations for the immense amount of harm that the U.S. has caused in this generation and before. The suggestion that reparations are owed by the United States to the immense damage we've done in the current generation is not mentioned very often, because the people who are talking about it in this country are the people who have been responsible for that damage. The rest of the world knows that, though, and if we were doing anything at all reasonable about the harm that we've caused, we'd be paying reparations. So it should, dealing with American warfighting is not a matter of saving money, but of putting it in a different place. You are watching Aware on the Air. Our subject is America's wars. Karen, do you
Yeah,
want to
okay, back
take
away
this up?
now. Yeah, back away now, Andrew. Get the three of us in it, because now we're going to discussion time. According to Mike Lofgren's The Deep State, he's made the point that if you go to, I think his name is Winslow Wheeler, he was with the Treasury Department previously, and he was in charge of this, and now that he's retired, he has documented much, and he's come up with the fact that we're not getting the true information. Now, at the panel discussion on Sunday, I believe the data that Morton Brussel provided for us claimed that currently the military is spending, 64 billion, is that correct? Stuart, Carl, do you remember?
64 billion on what?
64 billion, or 64%, I'm sorry, that our current military budget is 64%. But what Mike Lofgren, or what Winston
Not that big, but
Wheeler points out, is that there are hidden costs, and the hidden costs are that, number one, Homeland Security is now in charge of national security. So Homeland Security is not under the military budget. And the military, the Pentagon, is no longer in charge of national security. That's number one. Number two is the fact that all nuclear weapons are they are not being covered under the military budget, okay, or under the Pentagon. They now come under the Energy Department. Now, I'm not sure where the Energy Department is listed, probably under government, you mentioned government.
With Perry's back pocket, I think.
Yeah, whatever. The thing is, there are a lot of hidden costs when it comes to our military. I mean, we know that there's a huge slush fund that the CIA uses when they are paying various different people, groups, when they're supporting ISIS. Does this all come under the Pentagon? I don't know. Where does the CIA budget come under? Does it come under State Department? Does it come under Pentagon? So it really, we're not getting a total full picture here, as much as we try. That's all I have to say on the panel. I wanted to bring up today that what I think is the most important issue right now is the U.S. downing of a Syrian government plane in Syria. And the action now that Russia has taken verbally only, they're still only verbally warning us that this is dangerous. But it's a warning that is serious enough that Australia, one of our coalition partners, has taken a stand that they're not going to be doing military strikes right now. Now, this may only be temporary, but they're halting their military strikes because they recognize this is a very serious situation.
I think
And,
you're right about that. They are recognizing that. Apparently, what Australia is doing is simply refusing to fly over Syria.
Right.
They're continuing to participate in the military in the airstrikes in Iraq.
Right,
so-
yeah. Syria
but-
only I'm referring
And
to.
the reason they're not flying over Syria is the Russians said,
Right.
we're going to consider anybody for anything, anyone flying west of the Euphrates as being a potential target.
Exactly.
Australians
Exactly.
aren't stupid. They realize what that
Right.
means. And the example of Australia that you accurately point out of Australia's reluctance to participate in that suggests just how serious the matter has gotten between Russia and the United States.
Right, exactly. And I think that's something that needs to be focused on. It is not being focused on by mainstream media, to my knowledge, but I don't watch or listen to mainstream media, so I honestly don't know. But I know that whatever they discuss about it, it will somehow appear that the Russians are threatening us somehow. You know, it's always about the Russians. I was listening to the first three parts of the interview that Oliver Stone did with Putin, and I haven't watched number 4 yet, but I highly recommend it to anyone. I was tempted to say, I've seen bits and pieces of it, and I know what's happening. I don't really, but it really takes you into, I think, the perspective of Russia and of their leaders. And I think this is something American people need to grasp. They need to understand that others have a perspective. Our exceptionalism that we seem to take upon ourselves it becomes so what I call internal or narcissistic that we lose our perspective. And I think we really need a global perspective. And I think that Oliver Stone really worked very hard to give us that perspective. He's also being criticized now as a result of making, from what I understand, making Putin appear human or something. And it's like, this is so ridiculous. I mean, Oliver Stone has been the anti-war one filmmaker you could always count on to give you the truth. And suddenly now the media, the mainstream media is like, oh, well, you know, we're not too pleased with this or something. So I wanted to mention that. A couple weeks ago when I was on here, I was talking about the Rohingya situation, which I bored everybody to death with all the details. My point on that was simply that what the U.S. government does is creates chaos. That's something that Putin and Russia and China absolutely refuse to tolerate in their vicinity. And by chaos, all we have to do is look at what the U.S. is responsible for in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Libya, and now Syria. Total destruction and death and chaos. And it means perpetual war, and we are continuing with this chaos. And we are taking this to Burma. That's where the Rohingya are a Muslim group of people who the government there has killed hundreds and if not thousands. And now there's supposedly a group that is taken up arms and uprising. And they're being supplied by weapons from the Saudis. And that's something I think is worth noting. We keep talking about the arms deals that the U.S. makes when we sell weapons to Saudi Arabia to be used against Yemen. But I would like to mention the fact that I really think they're selling a lot of weapons to a lot of people around the world. It isn't just weapons that they are using in Yemen. And they are providing supposedly the Rohingya, and as well as with training. Now, the Saudis providing the Rohingya with training, you got to be kidding. The Saudis, even with U.S. training, they are still rather, militarily, they are still rather, what is the word I want to use, rather poor at it. And in respect to the chaos that we create around the world and what I see happening, it's all about China, okay? We know at the end of the day, it's all about China. And that means Iran and Russia and China. In the meantime, Kazakhstan. I don't have any real details or information on Kazakhstan, but there is some serious things happening there. And I just want to point out on this map, Kazakhstan is was part of the USSR, and it is right on the border of Russia. And so if the U.S. does the same thing that in Kazakhstan that they have been doing elsewhere in the world, right on Russia's border there, I think we're looking at more very serious trouble. I know that the U.S., with contractors, I know personally, we were involved in Almaty doing construction work, supposedly, as far back as 10, 15 years ago. Not quite 15 years ago, but at least 10 years ago. So and the Asian Development Bank is there, and all the NGOs that eventually we utilize in order to bring in our advisors. And I just wanted to bring that up. I think it's important.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air. Our task is to talk about the wars that the United States is carrying on, a theme that you do not hear much of in American news, except in a roundabout sort of ways. The New York Times reported on Monday, had a headline on Monday, which said, "Russia warns U.S. after downing of Syrian warplane," referring to the shooting down of a Syrian government plane by United States forces in the middle of Syria. A friend of Aware, the professor of law at the University of Illinois, Francis Boyle, points out in a note this week that the U.S. has no legal right to be in, even to be in Syria, much less to be killing people in Syria and shooting down planes. This is contrary to any international law. Indeed, it's contrary to American law as well. If we were to follow the 1793 Constitution, an American president who was responsible for the shooting down of a foreign airplane, absent a declaration of war or even an authorization for the use of military force, as we say these days, would be impeached. This has been the case for a good while, but we choose to ignore it, and indeed our media sources are particularly adept at doing that. 2017 has not gone as planned for the unelected power establishment of the United States. Hillary Clinton was meant to have won the election last year, invaded the strategically crucial nation of Syria with 70,000 ground troops to cripple its anti-aircraft system and seize control of its airspace, as she'd promised to do throughout her entire campaign. And the inevitable retaliation against that blatant act of war would result in a full-scale invasion of Syria and the regime change that the American deep state has been chasing for years. Instead, the failure of the establishment propaganda machine in 2016 led to the election of a president who'd campaigned on the promise of staying out of Syria, a platform that Trump's base has ferociously defended, even against Trump himself. This, combined with the fact that there is still widespread public opposition to full-scale war with Syria, has forced the U.S. power establishment to get a little creative with its consent manufacturing business this time around, but they've managed to come up with a solid strategy for cooking up support for the war. To get a picture of what this revised strategy for Syria looks like, try this. Imagine that your neighbor breaks into your house, comes into your living room, and stands very close to you. Now, to get the image right, you are the nation of Syria, eh? The neighbor is the United States. He takes up as much of your space as he possibly can in your house, stands in front of you so you can't see, breathes down your neck, puts his hands in your pockets, takes your food out of your hand when you try to eat. If during this time you accidentally brush up against your neighbor, he screams at you and slaps you in the face. Now remember, to keep this metaphor going, you got to realize the neighbor is the United States and the homeowner is Syria. And you know during all this that if any time you retaliate by slapping him back, your neighbor will murder you and take your house. The U.S. will invade Syria, will attack and invade Syria. This is what we're seeing in Syria today. where yet another deadly attack on Assad's forces, Assad, the president of Syria, has been carried out by U.S. military invaders in the name of self-defense. The invaders are defending themselves against the homeowner, in order to provoke a response from the Syrian government so that the U.S. power establishment can finally get its regime change war going. This is from a column by Caitlin Johnstone, who's been writing very good stuff on these issues for a while now. She writes, "Less than 2 weeks ago, I pointed out that these attacks are getting closer and closer together. And now at just 12 days, this is the shortest amount of time between attacks yet." She's talking about attacks by the United States in, quote, self-defense, close quote, in Syria. A Syrian warplane dropped bombs a little too close to the newly created U.S. proxy army currently fighting under the name Syrian Democratic Forces, officially to fight ISIS and unofficially to allow America's power establishment to insert itself more deeply into the region, and the U.S. Air Force shot that plane and its pilot out of existence in its first air-to-air kill since 1999. Again, the Syrian plane did not attack the U.S. bankrolled Syrian Democratic Forces. It just dropped bombs near them. And no actual U.S. forces were anywhere on the ground. This was all it took for the U.S. to launch a fourth intentional deadly attack on the Syrian military since April. This is all the U.S. deep state needs to do in order to get the regime change war it's been salivating over. If it keeps taking up space in areas where Assad's military is conducting operations under the pretense of counterterrorism and humanitarianism, eventually somebody's going to move a little too close or do something that could be construed as a potential threat, and they'll be attacked. U.S. military personnel don't even have to be clued in to the nature of the agenda that they are enabling for these attacks to become a certainty. They only need to be placed in areas where they're likely to encounter Syrian forces and given loose rules of engagement. Eventually, Assad will be forced to defend his military from the invading U.S. forces, which keep attacking it. Friendly reminder that the U.S. is in Syria without the permission of its government, and there's no valid reason for it to be there at all. Not only without the permission of the Syrian government, without the permission of the government of the United States of America, according to the Constitution, nor of the government of, nor of the United Nations. This is the same policy that the Obama administration followed and that Trump attacked during the campaign, but is now following in office. Then the American establishment will have their own Pearl Harbor from an incident like this. Any counteroffensive will be spun by Western media as an unprovoked attack by a murderous dictator, and the photographs of any U.S. servicemen slain will be paraded in front of the camera night and day. This will be enough to manufacture consent among the uninformed masses for yet another regime change invasion of yet another strategic location in the fossil fuel battles. The hope may even be that this manipulation will be enough to wedge Syria apart from its longtime ally Russia, who also has a military presence in the region. And Russia has a military presence in the region at the invitation of the legitimate government of Syria in order to protect it against the terrorists financed by the United States. Again, this isn't even the deep state's only path to full-scale war with Syria. French President Emmanuel Macron has already warned Russian President Vladimir Putin that there will be military retaliation from NATO against the Syrian government the next time it's believed that Assad has used chemical weapons. This means that NATO forces are already one false flag gas attack away from a full-scale military assault on Syria, which would likely wind up being against Russia and its allies as well. Al-Qaeda is believed to have been making sarin in Syria, sarin gas, the nerve gas, in Syria since 2013. And there's much reason to believe that not only was April's sarin gas attack perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, but the one in 2013 was as well. We could very well be a few clever terrorists and a canister of sarin away from World War III. It's like nobody learned anything from Iraq at all. Republican Party loyalists have been defending every U.S. attack on the Syrian government with the same idiotic flag-waving gusto they displayed in 2003 And Democratic Party loyalists are swallowing the entire Washington Post narrative about both Putin and Assad while referring to U.S. intelligence agencies as trustworthy sources of information. You remember how that was before Iraq. The mainstream media lies constantly and lies about Syria in particular, just like they lied to us about Iraq. And establishment loyalists on both sides of the political aisle are swallowing it all hook, line, and sinker. They haven't learned a damn thing. We need to remind them, write Caitlin Johnstone. We need to wake them up. Please help get the word out about what these horrible people are doing in Syria before they drag us all into something potentially world-ending. That's a column from Caitlin Johnstone, whose material can be found on the web. I will put links to these things we've talked about tonight on the Facebook page for Aware, but I recommend Ms. Johnstone strongly. She, and it's not unfortunately a metaphor, knows where the bodies are buried. You're watching Aware on the Air. Comments?
I recommend Counterpunch. I think there's some good stuff there, especially by her and Mike Whitney and a few others.
Thanks for mentioning that. Whitney's piece is a slightly different tone from the one I've just read. Mike Whitney's piece on the Counterpunch website, but is the best short account, I think, of the situation in Syria that the U.S. is duplicitously arranging in order to maintain its war in Southwest Asia. That's what's happening. And the fact that you don't hear about that on CNN doesn't make it any less true. I would recommend, by the way, the Counterpunch People's public print version. This is the Counterpunch magazine, which you can find reference to on the Counterpunch website, along with the columns they post this week. Some of the best stuff around on the subjects we're talking about. And while we're talking about this old-fashioned media, I might also say that Harper's Magazine has recently outdone itself, I think, on these issues, particularly its Washington editor, Andrew Coburn, who has a piece in this current Harper's on the Democrats that gives, I think, the best short account of the utter disarray of the Democratic Party and its support for the war party. It's an essential part of the war party in Washington right now that will keep you up at night if you're not a good sleeper. I recommend both these journals, and some of their material can be found online, but every now and then you have to look at print too. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the war policy of the United States, government, specifically in regard to Southwest Asia, the Middle East, as we call it from our particular perspective. But there is, unfortunately, far too much going on that is not discussed in our media, and our task here at Aware is to try to mention a few of these things and suggest where you might find more information about it. Comments, ladies and gentlemen?
Stuart?
Let's see. A comment on something you've been talking, Karen, about Oliver Stone. So he was here in town about 3 years ago for Ebert Fest. And they showed a film of his, Born on the 4th of July, which is, I think, really quite a good anti-war film.
That was very good.
And so, of course, he was speaking afterward, not only about the film, but about U.S. imperial policy. And at the time, and this, of course, was in the midst of the Obama administration, but it's at least as true now, he was alarmed by the ramping up of rhetoric against Russia. You know, he was saying, this is an echo of the Cold War. People are taking it as, people are taking the demonization of Russia at face value, and this was, it would be all too easy to go from there into full-out war.
Right.
And that's very much true today. You know, if we have any memory at all of the war in Afghanistan, which after some years many people in the United States said, well, maybe this wasn't really a good idea, but we're stuck with it now. The war in Iraq, which people said the same thing. The low level, the Cold War, and the economic war that we've been having for years against Iran. and all the rest, where after they've been running for a while, people say, oh, this one was a bad idea. But well, there's always the next war and the next population that we need to save, or the next despot we need to depose. I guess if there's anything we can hope from reminding people of our own recent history, it's to give us a way to avoid falling into the next trap.
Well, we don't teach history in school anymore,
Well.
real history. Not that we ever did. Not that we ever did.
I'd agree with you, Stuart, particularly if we see what the trap is and who's setting the trap. The trap is a thought trap, a verbal trap, a trap of ideas that's being set by the American ascendancy for the American people. We remember that the wars that the United States carry on are not in the interest of the majority of the American population, but are very much in the interest of a small minority of the American population, the very rich. This has been true indeed from the beginning, from the time that George Washington spoke of America, of the United States, as an incipient empire, and as we've come to recognize more and more these days, the Revolutionary War, as we call it, was carried out primarily to defend slavery, for fear that the British government would end the fundamental economic prop of the settler colonial society in America in the late 18th century, that is slavery. The threat to slavery, the threat to abolish slavery, was what led the United States to go to war against Great Britain in 1775. Now, unfortunately, that's not the way the story is told. And since we don't learn the history, we don't learn the continuity of that history and the continuity of the policy that the United States follows, particularly in killing people around the world. To come to our own time, the U.S. wars in what we call the Mideast right now are not accidents. They're not traps that we've fallen into as a country. They're traps set for the American people in order to convince an anti-war public, which is what in fact we have in this country, that there is reason to kill people abroad. There are causes that we need to fight for. There aren't. All the causes that the United States has gone to war in our lifetime and even before, have been causes of the profits of the 1%. Up to and including, I might say, the paradigm case for American war, that is the Second World War. I've recommended here before Nicholson Baker's wonderful book it's a decade old now, called Human Smoke, that tries to redress this propaganda balance that we have in this country about how the U.S. Rose up in high dudgeon and realized that fascists in Japan and Nazis in Europe were persecuting poor people, and therefore we rode out and stopped them from doing it. That's not what happened. But the result was that in 1945, at the end of the war, the U.S. was the only undamaged country with 5% of the world's population and 50% of the world's wealth. And that the politics, the wars of our lifetime, have been wars by the United States to maintain that disparity, as George Kennan, the post-war planner, put it. To maintain the disparity, the U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people since 1945. What we need to become aware of is what the U.S. is doing, the traps that are being set by the U.S. propaganda system, the most sophisticated in the world, for Americans, so Americans won't see what they're responsible for. That's what's going on, and that's what we need to break through. And it seems to me that the sorts of things that Caitlin Johnstone and our friends at Counterpunch and elsewhere are saying make that clearer now, perhaps, than it's been at any time, at least since the end of the Vietnam War. The immense effort expended by the American establishment to overcome the criticism of American war making that grew out of Vietnam was probably essentially effective. As George Bush Sr. said, they had disposed of the Vietnam Syndrome once for all. The Vietnam Syndrome was the conclusion from people who had seen the Vietnamese War that the war was a great crime and that the U.S. should not be committing crimes like that. The attitude has been reversed in our lifetime, and it's indeed that's what we're dealing, and indeed that is what we're dealing with now when we talk about the wars in the Middle East being carried out by all recent administrations. Aware on the Air is a program that is devoted to trying to talk about these issues, and there should be more of us. Comments?
Yeah, I would like to mention the fact that this morning news was breaking news from the Real News and plus some other media that you know about. No, not Close Up. Three of us are having this conversation now. About Israel's involvement with Syria. And we know that Israel has had planes and they've been bombing. It wasn't as well known until a couple months ago. The World Socialist website mentioned that. I talked about it. But this morning, the breaking news was that they have been assisting rebels, training rebels with weapons, with training, with a lot of money right over the border of Israel. And I think they have their own group of Israelis that they are calling the Golan Heights group or something. And it is all about the Golan Heights, which for Israel, Syria has always been about the Golan Heights. Not just the Golan Heights. But this evidently, they're going in with the people, they're working with the people, and they're doing it in such a way so that when it's highlighted, they can say, well, we've been helping the people, we've been working with the people, which is what we get a lot of. But in fact, they are not. It's all about the war movement and the takeover. Israel wants the same thing the U.S. wants. We want the same thing they want. Regime change because we want our puppet in power, and if we can't have that, which it looks like we may not get, then of course it will be splintering. And Carl, you're better on, I don't know, Stuart, maybe you know this, there are areas of Syria that are critical to the U.S., and the road leading from Damascus, or from, now we're talking about the highway from Qatar, and the gas pipeline that the U.S. wants to deliver gas to Europe. I'm a little weak on details here, but it's becoming very, very obvious that what it is, what the Western powers are looking at.
I think there were two fights this week that are particularly important for us to notice, and it's a little difficult to notice them through the sort of reporting that we get. There's a political fight at home in the Trump administration, not exactly the one that you've been hearing about, Russiagate and so forth, but a real political fight going on within the Trump administration as well as assaults on the Trump administration. The second fight that was going on this week that seems to me to be of paramount importance is the one we've been talking about. The actual fighting, the war making, the killing going on in Syria as a result of U.S. policy supporting the jihadists, including the people that U.S. principal ally Israel is supporting, as Karen was just describing. The relevance of these two fights to one another is worth remarking on. What's going on in the administration, the symbolic fight, if you like, is a contest between the war party, politics has outrun our language here to some extent. People talk about the deep state or the political establishment and so forth. It seems to me that the phrase war party may be better because it involves Republicans and Democrats, of course, a good bit of the Pentagon, a good bit of the, quote, intelligence community, close quote, that is the spooks, a good bit of the financial establishment of the American government as well.
And a lot of contractors,
mostly the defense industries. These are all covered with euphemisms. I mean, defense industry, building immense machines to kill people, and needs to demonstrate every now and then that they do their job. the War Party then was profoundly frightened by the Trump campaign. We have to realize that. I don't think people, with all the talk about Trump is such a wonderful cartoon figure that people don't notice what the War Party, what the American political establishment actually made of him. As Caitlin Johnson was saying, and what I was reading a moment ago, nobody expected him to become president, and the establishment, the War Party, saw in him someone who, for the first time in 40 years, was a presidential candidate who criticized what the War Party was doing. All recent presidential candidates have supported one way or another the war making of the United States, and only occasionally suggested that it could be carried on more intelligently. Remember Barack Obama attacking dumb wars? We want only smart wars. And people suggested that Barack Obama was the man to conduct smart wars for us. What Trump did was to attack the war making in the United States in a way that had not been done by a mainline political candidate for the presidency since George McGovern. Now, that scared the War Party. Unless we realize how frightened the War Party was by Trump when it turned out that people actually elected him, in spite of all the War Party could do, we don't understand how much energy was expended in making sure that Trump wouldn't act on any of those criticisms of the war making that he'd made during the campaign, and that his administration would go back to the provocations, particularly of Russia and China, that had been the standard fare of all previous administrations. They've succeeded for all practical purposes. Trump ostentatiously says he's turning his war making over to the generals. The generals turn out to be the same people who've been conducting those wars and those war provocations for a generation. And they're very much back in charge, and as a result, we get the shoot down of the Syrian plane this week. So Trump's criticisms have come to nothing, but that shouldn't blind us to the fact that they profoundly frightened the political establishment, and the political establishment is moving heaven and earth to make sure that no one gets those ideas into practice. So that's the fight that's going on in Washington. The way they've done it is particularly clever, I think, in regard to the Trump administration, because Trump did condemn terrorism. Who speaks for terrorism, after all? Trump condemned terrorism and said he would move against it, and that the Obama administration had not been moving against it very effectively. Well, he put his finger on a sore point there. That happened to be true, because in fact, the Obama administration was sponsoring the terrorists. He was sponsoring the jihadists in Syria in order to overthrow the Syrian government. American policy doesn't change in the Middle East. Tactics change very slightly, and the lies change some. But Trump pointed out, however consciously we might ask, the lie that Obama was opposing terrorism in the Middle East and the people that he was killing. He wasn't opposing terrorism, he was using the terrorists against governments that were not willing to follow American orders, notably the government in Damascus, the government of Syria. The Obama-Clinton administration sponsored ISIS.
And so is
directly.
Trump. It's not over. Come on, Carl.
Not directly. The Obama-Clinton administration
Yeah, but Trump is
sponsored
too.
the terrorism of ISIS by realizing that it could be used against the recalcitrant Middle Eastern powers that the United States wants to bring to heel, notably Syria and Iran. So the continuation of the attempt to control the Middle East under the cover of opposing terrorism was outed by Trump, as we say. Not clear how conscious he was of what they were doing, but he was right about what they were doing, and that scared the establishment to a great extent. They're back in control now. they've got Trump's generals running their war in the Middle East, and the war is proceeding apace as it did under the previous administration, and the dangers are very great. We need an anti-war movement in this country, an anti-war movement opposed to American war in Southwest Asia as much as we had an anti-war movement opposed to American war in Southeast Asia 2 generations ago. There's a lot of work to do.
What-
You're watching Aware on the Air, Karen?
Yeah. The one thing I keep trying to point out is that the difference between Trump and Obama and you refer to as the Clinton administration when she was Secretary of State.
Clinton administration. Clinton was Secretary of State.
Right,
and
right.
was an important part of that administration.
But here's my point. They were willing to take on Libya and they were willing to go from 2 nations under Bush that we had intervened in and destroyed to increasing that to 8. Okay, expanding to 8 because most Americans were asleep during the Obama administration. All right, I'm sorry. Wake up, people. Now we've got Trump. You're awake. But focus on the most important issue, on the elephant in the room, all right? And that is warmongering, because the point of cost of war is where our money is being funneled and being taken away from social services. But here's the point I want to make. There has been a difference in strategy. The Pentagon was not happy with Obama administration when he took on both Russia and China, with NATO all over the border of Russia, and with the pivot to China, with our battleships there, and then talking about Iran. And the Pentagon's like, wait, and I can't remember who it was that made the statement, look, we've already got enough on our hands with the Middle East, China, and Russia, and now you want us to go in and take on Iran. But, and the one thing Obama did, to his credit, was the nuclear agreement that he initiated and they installed with Iran. Now, the Trump administration, what with McCain and with the real war hawks within the Republican Party, they're trying to do away with that. And we know for a fact, if they take on Iran before Iran has nuclear missiles, before they've gone nuclear, then Iran is likely to be, Iran is like a first step to Russia, all right? And we know they want to take on Russia, but not with Iran there. And that's one of the issues with Qatar, I think, from what I've been hearing, is that Qatar, depends on what accent you use, Qatar has been supporting Iran as well as Hamas. And that is something that the Saudis didn't like, but it's mostly it's the U.S. government didn't like. And so I think they're sort of putting Qatar adrift for that reason. So that's what we're looking at right now, is war with Iran, and I think that's very frightening. And I think that's what's happening under the Trump administration. And I just want to keep pointing out that I don't care who runs for president. We're looking at war no matter what. And I think that was your earlier point. Yeah.
Stuart? Well, someone on the United for Peace and Justice mailing list last summer, in the midst of the campaign, when people were talking about, who's better for war and peace among the presidential candidates, the major party ones, saying among the Democrats and the Republicans, no matter which will win, they're both war parties. We will have to argue against wars in either case. Trump had his own style of American belligerency, and he certainly was. Standing up and arguing against, past American behavior, but he just wanted to be belligerent in his own way, and now we've got the worst of both worlds.
American policy is remarkably consistent over time, and not just over the last couple of administrations, and not just in this century, but back for more than a century.
Right.
And what we find are certain terminological and fashion changes in the American war making, but the overall plan, which has been described as preventing the appearance of an economic rival in Eurasia, remains true back through the 20th century.
Right.
And that's also true of the current administration. But there is probably less candor about the matter now than there's been for a great deal of time. And that's indeed what we should be talking about. What is the United States doing, and how is it, in fact, consistent with what's gone before, but not consistent with the stories they're telling about it. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 25th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Dan Pano and Andrew Scalaway, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for the articles referred to tonight. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. This is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.